Yeah, I'm pleased to open the last session of this conference. And I'm also pleased to introduce our first speaker of the last session, which is Cornelia Zumbusch. She is Professor for German Literature at the University of Hamburg and also co-director of the Warburg House in Hamburg. So please, Cornelia.
And first of all, let me thank you for organizing this wonderful conference. I'm very happy and thankful to be here. I will speak on the Physik des Symbols, Aby Warburg, and the energy or the force of art. Thinking about art as a form of energy, power, or force seems to be as old as philosophical reflection itself. In his dialogue Ion, Platon let Socrates explain to Ion just why it is that he is such a successful prize-winning rhapsode. Why can he speak so well? Why does his recital of Homeric epics move his audience to laughter and tears? According to Socrates, this is achieved not by techne, but by dynamis. And I quote, "For as I was saying just now, this is not an art, techne in you, whereby you speak well on Homer, but a divine power, dynamis, which moves you like in that stone which Euripides named a magnet, but most people call Heracleia's stone. For this stone not only attracts iron rings, but also imparts to them a power whereby they in turn are able to do the very same thing as the stone and attract other rings. So that sometimes there is formed quite a long chain of bits of iron and rings suspended one from another. And they all depend for this power on that one stone. In the same manner, also the muse inspires man herself, and then by means of this inspired person, the inspiration spreads to others and holds them in a connected chain. For all the good epic poets utter all those fine poems not from art, but as inspired and possessed, and the good lyric poets likewise. As we learn from here, it is a divine force, theia de dynamis, that surprises the rhapsode as much as it had surprised the poet when he first conceived of his work. This dynamis is at nobody's command. It rather imparts itself, investing anything with its power and creating a chain which links the muse to the poet and then to the rhapsode and then to the audience. They are all suddenly connected, becoming both active and passive parts in a transmission which links the divine and the human sphere. The difference between techne and dynamis, later known as ars and ingenium, has shaped classical and early modern poetics and art theory. On the one hand, there is techne or ars, meaning the technical side of things, anything that depends on skill, training, and workmanship. On the other hand, there is divine dynamis, enthusiasm, inspiration, or ingenium, encompassing everything that cannot be taught or learned by rules. Thus, classical and Renaissance thought takes up the idea of true art being a divine gift or talent, while at the same time disguising the intimate relationship of art with a certain enigmatic dynamis, a mysterious and uncontrollable force overpowering both the poet and those performing or receiving his work. This intimate relationship between art and force has recently been addressed by Christoph Menke in his book Die Kraft der Kunst, The Force of Art. Menke builds his argument on Plato's distinction between techne and dynamis, extending it to 18th century aesthetic thought. Pointing out the connections between the onset of anthropology and of philosophical aesthetics around 1760, Menke places the force of art within the capacities of the human being. Reading German philosophers among the Mendelssohn, Sulzer, or Herder, it becomes clear that Kraft in 18th century aesthetic discourse is a vibrant term, defined precisely by the impossibility to be properly defined. Rather, it belongs to the very virtues of Kraft to be obscure and elusive. Like Plato's dynamis, Kraft cannot be reached or achieved through know-how and industrious application. Therefore, and this is Menke's valuable conclusion, from Menke's Foucauldian point of view, Kraft is not available to subjects that will constitute themselves only by practice, exercise, and discipline. That is why, on the one hand, art exceeds all things which are subjected to norms and regulations. On the other hand, a work of art in the modern sense, according to Menke, owes its existence only to the cooperation of Kraft, dunkle Kraft, and Vermögen, power and technique. What may be lost in this very important account of Menke, however, is the strange effect Plato attributes to this dynamis. The force Plato speaks about is the power of transformation and assimilation. It turns mere stones into magnetic stones that pass their magnetic quality onto other stones. What Plato envisioned is a mimetic chain reaction. What is also lost in Menke's account is the subtle irony in Plato's construction of a force that manifests itself in the weakness of those who are seized by it. The rhapsode and even the poet are nothing by themselves. They are mere receptacles of something divine. They are possessed, intoxicated, if not insane. In stressing this dehumanizing force of enthusiasm, Plato outlines a fundamental passivity of poetic production, or artistic production for that matter. Art is produced only under an influence, which is not necessarily the influence of intoxication, of course. As I would like to argue today, this notion of art under an influence is one of the legacies Warburg has taken on and left us maybe in a new shape. One brief look into Warburg's text shows that the ways in which images might tap, excite, or convey different kinds of forces are at the core of his thought. Words like Prägekraft, Überlebenskraft, or Kraftmaß, related notions such as Wucht, Gewalt, or Macht, rather more scientific-sounding terms such as Energie, Schwingungen, or Intensität, and newly coined terms such as Energiekonserve, energetische Inversion keep recurring in his notes as well as in his published essays. The cultural context of this rhetoric of energy has been brilliantly reconstructed by Ulrich Raulf in his book on wilde Energien, as well as by Thomas Hensel, who has placed Warburg's Bilderatlas in the context of the Bildertelegraphie invented in the late 1920s. And of course, Kurt Forster has brilliantly elaborated on that this morning. Warburg's use of the words Kraft and Energie seems to fit right into what Anselm Rabenbach has described as the energetic turn around 1900. But how does this modern fascination by energies tie in with the traditional notion of a dynamis of art, as outlined by Plato and developed in 18th century aesthetics? How does Warburg mediate the older concept of force with the newer modern concept of energy? I would like to argue that Warburg's notions of Kraft and Energie, force and energy, are intimately connected. Together, they point to a cultural history of images and also, and maybe even more important, to aesthetic processes in a stricter sense. Looking at Warburg's first introduction of the pathos formel, the force of images seems to be operating mainly on the level of Nachleben. As we all know, the first occurrence of the word pathos formel in Warburg's Dürer essay, published in 1905, is, considering its own striking afterlife, rather unimposing. It is only in passing by that Warburg points out, and I'll give you the German original, wie lebenskräftig sich dieselbe archäologisch getreue Pathos-Formel in Künstlerkreisen eingebürgert hatte. The English translation speaks of the vigor, lebenskräftig, vigor with which this archaeologically authentic emotive formula had taken root in Renaissance artistic circles. In this, by the way, introduction of a new word, Warburg maps out what he will trace and retrace in various ways. The impact of the antique Pathos-Formel on Renaissance art. Kraft is here first of all Lebenskraft. When Warburg speaks of the Pathos-Formel as lebenskräftig eingebürgert, he invests images with the property of living things. Yet the crucial point here is not the appearance of aliveness, of being alive, but rather the power to live on and to survive over time. On closer examination, it becomes apparent that Dürer's engraving is not only powerful, but in itself a complex display of human forces. And we've seen this picture several times during this conference. The image of Orpheus being beaten to death by two furious Maenads shows off the physical force of moving bodies and the intensity of the depicted emotions. In confronting the suffering man with the two furies, the Pathos formula combines despair and anger, fear and violence, helpless defense, and excessive aggressiveness, powerlessness, and power. One might even ask, is this one Pater's formula? Are those two Pater's formula, or are this the first Maynards and the self-defending Orpheus, is it one? Is it the combination of both? Warburg isn't specific on that. Moreover, it might not be a mere coincidence that this scene evolves around the greatest poet known in Greek mythology, Orpheus, who was able to move to tears all living things that happened to hear him. Warburg's first Pater's formel is the image of an artist fending off two Maynards, maybe as pictorial representations of unrestrained movement and Dionysic intensity. It is the scene of an artist trying to defend himself against the mythological forces rushing towards him. This theme of resistance resurfaces on the level of the historic forces Warburg tries to describe. As becomes clear toward the end of the short essay, the Überlebenskraft of the antique images is met with a counterforce, a Widerstandskraft, which Warburg attributes to Dürer. So setzt er, Dürer, der paganen südlichen Lebhaftigkeit den instinktiven Widerstand seiner bodenständigen nürnbergischen Gelassenheit entgegen, die sich seinen antikisch gestikulierenden Figuren wie ein Oberton ruhiger Widerstandskraft mitteilt. Widerstand, resistance, sadly lost in the English translation, but twice in the German original. By stressing the fact that images are products of competing forces, Warburg's notion of powerful images seeks to describe the historical dynamic. This means at least two things. Firstly, the power of images manifests itself in the interplay of the different forces they depict or represent. Secondly, the strong image is strong because it has successfully fended off all excessive forces which have been set free by other images. The power of resistance Warburg attributes to Dürer is a counterforce that lives up to the challenge posed by antiquity. In Warburg's equally short, yet rather more condensed text known as Mnemosyne Introduction from 1929, the German word Kraft is almost completely replaced by notions of energy. Warburg points to a range of extremely intense experiences represented and transported in images he calls energetic. His term energetic inversion, energetische Inversion, points at the semantic changes experienced by images over time. Reactive energy, reaktive Energie, means the energy with which Renaissance art tries to free itself from medieval restraint. It is akin to the Widerstandskraft Warburg attributes to Dürer, although it is directed not against the powerful images inherited from classical antiquity, but uses their help in the process of emancipation from the immediate past. Energy is also implied in his use of the word Schwingungen, vibrations. It is not only the recipient, but before him the artist who picks up these Schwingungen conserved in the antique images. It seems to me that this shift from Kraft to Energie, from force to energy, does not necessarily imply a change in Warburg's basic concepts. Rather, I would like to argue Warburg's indifferent use of Kraft and Energie leads to a historical zone of indifference the two concepts have shared in the second half of the 19th century, an indifference which may lead us to the core of Warburg's concept of a force or energy of art. In 1847, Hermann von Helmholtz, who is at that time still a physiologist but will later be a physicist, gives a lecture on Die Konstanz der Kraft, the consistency of force. Using the word Kraft, he formulates the first law of thermodynamics. This law states that the quantity of effective force contained in the universe cannot be changed. That is, it will be neither increased nor diminished. Or in the German original, die Quantität der in dem Naturganzen vorhandenen wirkungsfähigen Kraft ist unveränderlich. What Helmholtz refers to as Kraft will later be termed energy, indicating new fields of investigation. Thermodynamic theories of energy concentrate on the possibilities to produce heat and the capability of this heat to do work. The steam engine becomes the signature of the technical and industrial applications of the new theory. Energy is here basically defined as that which is constant within a system. Yet the seemingly new concept has essentially been formulated within classical mechanics and its notion of Krafterhaltung. Looking at the pendulum, Leibniz and Kant had observed what they called vis viva, or lebendige Kraft, pointing to the fact that the sum of what will later be called potential versus kinetic energy is constant within a given system. This model of potential and kinetic energy plays a significant role in Warburg's theory of symbols, or what he calls a Physik des Symbols, physics of the symbol. In his Zettelkasten number 4, Warburg has filed an excerpt of Helm's Die Lehre von der Energie, published in 1887, describing these two types of energy. Kinetische Energie, Bewegungsenergie, potenzielle Energie der Lage oder der Anordnung. Ein schwingendes Pendel enthält in seiner größten Ausweichung eine potenzielle, in seiner Gleichgewichtslage eine kinetische Energie. In jeder anderen Lage ist potenzielle und kinetische Energie vorhanden, deren Summen jedoch immer gleich. Bei der schwingenden Bewegung findet eine unausgesetzte Umwandlung von einer Energieart in die andere statt. So energy is always constant, it's only transformed from kinetic to potential. It is this very Umwandlung, transformation from one type of energy to the other, that Warburg is interested in, exactly because it is a transformation that is performed by symbols. This problem is addressed in the Fragmente zur Ausdruckskunde, in which Warburg reflects on a physics of thinking, Physik des Denkens, and compares symbolism to gravity. Die Lehre von der Symbolik shall be assumed as das, was für die Kosmologie die Lehre von der Schwerkraft ist. So he's making an analogy. Symbolism is analogous to gravity and cosmology. This analogy is interesting because it defines symbolism as something that cannot be defined. Gravity in Newton's classical mechanics is a vis occulta, something that can only be observed in its effects, but not in itself. Warburg's analogy, therefore, implies that the human power of symbolization is as central to our understanding of the world and yet as hidden as the force of gravity. In the subsequent remarks, Warburg elaborates on his comparison. Symbols, so he says, have an attractive force, eine Anziehungskraft. We are mysteriously drawn to using them again and again. This appeal of certain symbols is due to their ability to substitute, reduce, and condensate sense impressions. Warburg calls the substitution a Vergleich, a comparison. The substitution is an economic necessity because the human mind is not capable of recording every little detail it may have perceived, especially when it is forced to perceive bodies in motion. In order to store these highly complex impressions, the information has to be abridged, verkürzt, Warburg says. This reduction does not weaken the initial perception, but rather heighten it. It is a condensation of the impression. And by condensating these perceptions, the symbol is even more intense than the impression ever was. It is something, Warburg says, der Kraft nach, stärkeres, stronger regarding its force. This is why we are drawn to certain symbols. In his fragmentary collection called Symbolismus als Umfangsbestimmung, Warburg takes up these considerations. The subtitle of this new collection, Funktion der Schwerkraft im geistigen Haushalt, Function of Gravity in the Economy of the Mind, is rather telling with regard to Warburg's own thought process, because as you may have noticed, Warburg has reduced his original comparison between symbolism and gravity by deleting the V. It's not a Vergleich anymore. By speaking of the function of gravity in the mind's economy, the initial status of the comparison is now hidden. Warburg's notion of a geistiger Haushalt, mind's economy, also stresses the ways and means of regulating these forces. This emphasis on the process of transformation marks the point where Warburg leaves the field of classical mechanics and maybe moves to the new paradigm of energy. The transition from impression to symbol is now conceptualized as Umschaltung der elektrischen, nervösen, energischen Spannung, as a switching over to another level of tension or voltage, be it electric or nervous. Warburg's theory is performing the process he tries to conceptualize. He leaps from one frame of reference to another, from the older framework of force and gravity to the new paradigm of energy and Spannung. Yet what I would like to stress is that this change in reference does not imply a new concept, but points to the area where both concepts overlap. Symbols seem to transform the kinetic energy or force of moving things in the world into potential energy or force that can be discharged and transformed again. It is the key notion of conservation by transformation, formulated from Newton to Helmholtz as Krafterhaltung, that informs Warburg's indifferent use of the words Kraft and Energie. It also leads to his core concept of Erhaltung or Konstanz that links Warburg's Dürer-essay to the Mnemosyne-Einleitung. What Warburg himself calls a miracle in this introduction is its lebendig bleiben and its Gleichbleiben. Oh, sorry, this is not the quote that I have. You have to ignore this. I only give it to you in German. It's a quote from the Mnemosyne-Einleitung. Durch das Wunderwerk des normalen Menschenauges bleiben in Italien im starren Steinwerk der antiken Vorzeit Jahrhunderte überdauernd den Nachfahren gleiche seelische Schwingungen lebendig, psychic vibrations keeping alive, which means they're being constant. Let me return at last to the question I set out in the beginning. In what ways is Warburg's notion of energetic images connected to the tradition of dynamis as a divine influence taking possession of a passive artist? An answer might be given by one last look in one of Warburg's published works. In his essay on the influence of astrology on the Palazzo Schifanoia in Ferrara, Warburg solves a pictorial puzzle posed by the fresco cycle, identifying the iconological program as a pictorial representation of astrological handbooks. Warburg's text mingles the mysterious influence of the stars with the influence of astrology on Renaissance thought and with the question of strong and weak artists, those who were able to resist the astrological influences and those who gave way to them. In his closing statement, and that's the thing you see here, in his closing statement, Warburg quite unexpectedly takes up the rather traditional concept of the genius. Our sense of wonder at the inexplicable fact of supreme artistic achievement can only be enhanced by the awareness that genius is both a gift of grace and a conscious dialectical energy. The grandeur of the new art, as given to us by the genius of Italy, had its roots in a shared determination to strip the humanist heritage of Greece of all its aggressions of traditional practice, whether medieval, oriental, or Latin. Art, here, is an inexplicable fact, as inexplicable as dynamis, which is observable only in its effects, not in their origins, which can be measured but may never be directly seen. Warburg calls it, in a somewhat anachronistic gesture, genius, harking back to the translation of the Greek dynamis with Latin ingenium. But what Warburg calls genius manifests itself not in the possessed passivity Plato implies in his magnetistic scenario. Genius, in Warburg's account, is distinguished by its Auseinandersetzungsenergie. That's the German original. The English translation gives you conscious dialectical energy. The German original is Auseinandersetzungsenergie. Auseinandersetzung implying the twofold sense of application and differentiation, of seeking a confrontation, sich auseinandersetzen mit etwas, and keeping apart opposites, etwas auseinanderhalten oder setzen. Echoing his appraisal of Dürers Widerstandskraft, genius is the obscure force that manifests itself in its resistance to traditional practices. Plato's enigmatic divine power, the theia de dynamis, which 18th century aesthetics transferred to the unconscious power of human beings, is in Warburg's thought reformulated not only as the power of images themselves, it is also transformed into the power of the artist who is strong enough to defend himself against the powers of images. It is an art of resistance to influence. Thank you.